Yeah.
Okay, all yours, Amy.
All right. Good morning, everyone. I'm Amy Snyder from the Connect and Communicate Series Planning Committee. Thank you for joining us for the Connect and Communicate series presenting Oral History 101, creating an oral history program for your library. This discussion will be recorded and it will be made available to Pennsylvania Library Association College and Research Division members through the PALA website, as well as sent to registrants and available on the CRD blog. For this discussion, you will only need a headset or speakers. You should also see that the Zoom live transcription feature is turned on for closed captioning during this session. We encourage you to ask questions in the chat box at the bottom right. Questions will be addressed at the end of the session. We'll also do our best to assist participants with technical issues. Please post those issues in the chat box as well. This session is brought to you by the Pennsylvania Library Association College and Research Division's Connect and Communicate series. I'd like to thank the CRD board for supporting the Connect and Communicate initiative and the other Connect and Communicate Planning Committee members. Adam Balchunas, Rana Lisioko, Diane Porterfield, myself, and Christy Alderman Ritter, who is helping with the technical aspects of today's session. Please contact any one of the team for information about becoming a PALA member. This project is made possible by a grant from the Institute of Museum and Library Services, as administered by the Pennsylvania Department of Education through the Office of Commonwealth Libraries and the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania Tom Wolf Governor. And finally, I'd like to thank and introduce our presenter for today's event. Heidi Abby Moyer has been an academic librarian for over 28 years. Originally from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, she holds a BA in Biology and Art History, MA in Art History, and MLS specializing in archives and records management. Currently, Ms. Moyer serves as the college archivist, humanities reference librarian, faculty liaison to the School of Humanities, and coordinator of archives and special collections in the Madeline L. Haynes Library at Penn State Harrisburg, Middletown, PA. In 2013, she earned tenure and was promoted to associate librarian. Her research agenda is extremely interdisciplinary and has previously centered around social justice topics such as DEIBA, diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, and accessibility, including promotion and tenure for academic archivists, archival advocacy and outreach, motherhood studies, oral history, wedding history, and women's suffrage in America. She is an active longtime writer of the MARAC Communications Committee and has served since 2017 as the editor and member of the editorial board for the MARAC Technical Leaflet Series. From 2017 to 2020, she served as co-chair of the Oral History Association's Archives Interest Group, the experiences from which informed her recently published entry, Oral History Program, Designing and Managing, and Dr. Patricia Frank's new edited book, The Handbook of Archival Practice, Roman and Littlefield, September 2021. And with that, I'd like to welcome and turn the presentation over to Heidi Abby Moyer.
Thank you so much, Amy. I hope everybody can hear me. Could I get a thumbs up from someone? I'm probably not going to be able to monitor the chat. Great, thank you. So thank you so much to everyone with PALA and the College and Research Division and all the members of the Connect and Communicate series webinar. I know how much time it takes to put these events on. So I'm really honored to be here today to share what I've learned really over the past, I would say, 6 years about oral history. There really is a lot to know. And I certainly don't feel like I'm an expert yet, but certainly I want to encourage as many librarians out there, and maybe there's even some archivists who are listening, to really consider some of the allied professions to library and information science, of which I believe oral history is one. We have a lot in common with oral historians and folklorists. We may speak a little bit of a different language and use different jargon, but essentially we're still trying to do the same thing, connect people to information. So today, I'm going to talk about oral history from a very basic standpoint and how you might be encouraged to establish an oral history program in your library. I am very interested in doing this because we're all going through a lot, and the pandemic certainly has inspired many people to think about their own personal histories and the history of the communities that they're in. So why don't we get started? And as usual, my PowerPoint slide is not agreeing with me to advance. So let me see if I can get it to advance. Ah, there we go. Okay. So in terms of what we're going to cover today, And I will try to limit my time to about 40 minutes so we have time for Q&A. I'm going to talk about really what oral history is if you're not used to a formal definition. Hopefully you'll walk away with one of those learning outcomes, which is to really understand more about oral history. Then I'm going to provide some what I call practical tools for how to develop an oral history program. And I've divided these into 8 different steps. Much of what I'll be discussing will deal with best practices and documentation. As librarians and archivists, we're all used to that. So hopefully that won't be any new information. Conducting the interview, though, I think is probably the more difficult aspect of oral history, because it really is an art and a science, much like archival processing or even working in reference and librarianship. There's a lot of post-interview work that you need to do. And then, of course, things that we're all used to, publishing and marketing, assessment and preservation. And lastly, I'll share a ton of references and resources with you, because I know that 40 minutes is not going to be enough time to teach you everything that I would love to share with you. And we'll, of course, have time for Q&A. So let's get started. What is oral history? Well, it depends on who you talk to. There's many different definitions, but I really have been informed a lot by what Baylor University's Institute for Oral History has been doing. Stephen Seeloff is one of the directors there, and this is a definition from Baylor University's many online tutorials and workshops and guides. And they define it as a sound recording of historical information that's obtained through an interview that preserves a person's life history or their eyewitness account of a past experience. So that's pretty specific, but that's not it. Oral history also requires at least 2 people. And then this is some jargon that you might not be familiar with, but one person questions, they're called the interviewer, and one person who narrates or is the interviewee the responses to those questions. So the narrator is the person that is really doing all of the talking. That interviewer is just there to facilitate the discussion and not to add commentary, which is really hard to do. You have to really sort of sit on your hands and bite your tongue and not say anything, because you don't want to add any extra bias or subjectivity to it. So just make sure you keep that in mind throughout the presentation. There's the interviewer, that's pretty obvious. And then the narrator, that's the interviewee. So I'll be using the term narrator a lot. The other aspect of oral history that is really important is that it is distinguished by subjectivity. It's a primary source at the end of the day. And it's also a partnership, though. Interviews are co-created. And that process by which that interview happens involves mutual trust, respect, and sensitivity. And those factors are really important. And before I started learning about oral history, I didn't really think about that because anybody can do an interview. But there's a lot of ethics involved in oral history, and it's taken very seriously. And I know this was a question that came prior to the webinar today, but there are copyright concerns, and a true oral history requires written, informed consent from the narrator or interviewee to record, copy, and distribute the interview. And that's really important to make sure that you have that in an interviewee/narrator release form. It has to be written, signed, and that's part of building trust, so that you are very clear up front with the person that you're interviewing what you're going to do with their interview, how you're going to make it available to people, how will it be preserved for the long term. So that's really a critical part of the definition of an oral history. So with that out of the way, let's get started with what you need to do. And I am very literal. I like to think of things in terms of a life cycle. Maybe that's my biology undergrad talking, but I always think of everything in a life cycle of some kind. And it's certainly true for oral history work. So the first thing you really should think about if you're going to do an oral history program is defining why you're doing it. What are your purposes? If you might have a vision or a mission, what are you going to set up with this program? What are the long-term and some short-term goals? And is oral history really the best way to do it? Maybe there's other tools that you could use to achieve the goals that you have. And also, if you have these outlined goals, can you really achieve them given the time that you have, the budget, the staff, the expertise amongst the staff that you have or volunteers, as well as the equipment? It can get pretty complicated, and I'm not going to even pretend to have all the answers today because there's so many factors, especially when you move beyond audio and you start talking about video. and a combination of audio and video. And then lastly, in terms of defining the purposes and goals, you want to make sure that you avoid what anybody does with project management, is avoiding scope creep. Make sure you don't take on too much, because it can really snowball out of control. And I'm sure many of you who are listening know what I'm talking about. So can you divide your program into different phases to manage it over time? So the other aspect of determining the scope and the themes is, what exactly are you hoping to get? What kind of information do you want to capture in these oral histories? And one way to think about that is a scope and the topic. So there's topical oral histories. They might focus on an event, such as the COVID-19 pandemic, a time era, right now, or maybe the 1950s, with folks in your community who may be more elderly now and have some really unique stories to share. An issue such as the Black Lives Matter movement, an organization such as your library, a particular place, a city, or even just a group of people such as first responders during the pandemic. So these are just examples of topical oral histories. It's certainly not exhaustive or meant to be the only topical oral histories you might have. You might also decide to do an oral history program based upon biographies, interviewing different people in your community. And then lastly, who will be interviewed and why, and who's going to interview them and when? There's so many questions to ask yourself. So you definitely want to think about all these different things before you even start recording. Of course, we can't talk about program planning without money and staff. And those are probably the biggest hurdles that people face. You don't have the in-house expertise. I didn't have it. I had to start learning, and I joined the Oral History Association Archives Interest Group back in 2017. And I just started developing my knowledge and creating a network of colleagues. And we're all good at doing that because we're librarians or archivists or other professionals who might be watching. So do you have any money? If you don't, that's okay. There are some free ways to do oral history that don't involve a lot of infrastructure or purchasing expensive software, but you do have to think about, whether or not you even have the time to do it. I have had to table some of my oral histories because I lost some staff who moved on to other positions, and then that expertise was gone. And also software changes over time. How you store and preserve these oral histories is also important. Do you have any kind of a sustainable budget? Do your staff have the ability to do research? Because it's not just sitting down interviewing someone. You need to do some background research and know as much about the narrator as possible before you even interview them. How to do interviews, how to conduct them very authentically and do it well is also a skill that needs to be honed over time. And then how do you manage the staff and manage the resources? Lastly, do you even have staff who are interested in learning how to do this and training them and working with staff and volunteers? And for a few years, I was on the board of directors at the Mount Breton Historical Society, where I was very happy to have that experience, and I helped them with their oral history program. So just training volunteers can be extremely time consuming, especially people who might not have a lot of IT skills. Helping them to operate the audio and visual equipment can also be really challenging. So think about all these questions. The third step is preparing for the interviews. And I cannot emphasize this enough, that you really need to establish guidelines and best practices. There are numerous websites online that I have in the end of my presentation to help you with that. One thing that I strongly advocate for is creating what I call an oral history toolkit. So that involves everything from how to teach somebody how to conduct an interview, to how to establish a good rapport with someone, the narrator, how to develop that sense of empathy and humility. And I'll be talking a little bit more about that, because those are really key concepts of being a good oral historian and being a good interview, is really being able to listen, practicing active listening. And sometimes we get into interviews with folks who are sharing painful memories. And there's a term in the field of oral history where it's called inherited trauma. And when someone is sharing a painful event, the psychological and emotional impact can have an effect upon the interviewer. So those are all things to be aware of, and I'll mention more about that later in a project that we're working on over the pandemic at Penn State Harrisburg. So there's some other interviewing techniques, such as do not interrupt the narrator. It's easy to feel like you should, but you shouldn't, because you don't want to introduce your bias and you don't want to add any judgments. And you also need to show interest, make good eye contact, respectfully, not staring at someone all the time. listen and also maintain that confidentiality. There was one question from someone before the session today of how would you approach someone who may have experienced some loss during the pandemic if you decided to do a COVID-19 oral history. And there's a lot of discussion, a lot of scholarly journal articles recently about that topic. And I would say tread lightly and definitely, use open-ended questions. And respecting that confidentiality and respecting the privacy of the narrator is also key. If someone is sharing something with you and all of a sudden they start to get very emotional, it's the job of the interviewer to say, would you like me to take a break? And you stop recording. So those are all things that you really need to hone in your skills as an interviewer. So as you can see, it gets really complicated, but it's all very important. Step 4 is preparing those questions in the forms, doing that background research. And you should develop a sample interview set of questions, a minimum of 10. You always want to have more questions than you think you're going to ask, because you never know if someone is going to be very short in their answers or they're going to talk forever and you run out of, the ability to record. So have a set of at least 10 open-ended as well as closed questions, because not everyone is going to be as open in their answers and some people will be more guarded. So again, that's developing trust over time, and maybe halfway through the interview, you start to get a lot more information from someone. And gathering what's called contextual materials, that's a really important preparatory step, because you need to make sure that you have an interviewee release form. That is essential. It regards the information that you are going to share with the world as far as this interview goes, and you need to be very transparent with the narrator about that. You also want to do your homework, get some biographical information about the narrator, because as you're doing the interview, there's things that you might be aware of that the narrator forgot. And so, if you email the narrator, talk to them on the phone, if they're not very tech savvy, they might prefer to, talk to you on the phone as opposed to over email. And they may have photographs. Photographs, like many other objects, can trigger memories. So if they have items from their life, that may also be something that you don't anticipate in the process of doing that interview. And so just be aware of that. And then using a checklist is essential, because, if someone's new at doing oral history, you can forget a lot. And it's a good idea to have a checklist. Equipment. This is probably what everybody wants to know about. There is so much information on the internet about what type of equipment and software you can use just to capture oral histories. So I highly recommend looking at Oral History in the Digital Age. This was an IMLS funded project, and Doug Boyd, who's at the University of Kentucky at the Nunn Center, a highly regarded oral historian, he has an amazing online tutorial that will help you with selecting recorders, microphones, dealing with audio and visual content. So Ask Doug is this great tutorial you can refer to. But my general advice is make sure that whatever you select is durable, reliable, and that it will create a file format that is lossless. So if you're not familiar with that term, a lossless file is uncompressed. It doesn't lose any digital information in its creation. So we, in the archives world, as well as in the oral history world, we use WAV files or AIF files. WAV is Microsoft, IBM, and AIF is Apple. And also make sure that the files are CD quality. So that involves 16-bit and at least 44.1 kilohertz sampling rate or better. And if this is all too much jargon for you, don't worry, just go online to the Ask Doug site and the Oral History in the Digital Age. And there is definitely not a lack of information to help you with that. And also the Baylor University, their Oral History Center also has amazing tools. So avoid lossy compressed file formats, like JPEGs are not so great in the image world, so you'd want to use TIFF. So similarly, you want to use WAV, not MP3 or MP4 files. Avoid proprietary formats that are owned by a certain company, that don't move about, don't have any support. Make sure you use microphones that are condenser and not dynamic types, and you can just get into the audio component of that and the details of that. You could spend hours. So I'll get into a little bit more detail next. So for those of you who are itching to know, like, what should you buy and how expensive is it? These are some more professional level recorders. You can certainly buy a Zoom, not the Zoom software that we've all been living on, but this company called Zoom makes these handheld digital recorders. The one that I'm recommending here is recommended by Doug Boyd at the University of Kentucky's Nunn Center. And this one costs about $300. It's the one that's on the left there, and it says Zoom at the bottom. It's very user-friendly, and the microphones are at the top. That one is excellent, has really high quality. There's also a Tascam DR-40X. That's also a handheld recorder. It's a little cheaper, decent quality for the money, but definitely the Zoom H5 is highly recommended by Doug Boyd. And then a lot of oral historians use Marantz. The Marantz PMD 661 MK3 is very good, but very expensive. It's about 500 or so. Maybe you can find a little cheaper online. And then at the bottom, you can see there's handheld microphones. There's also lavalier or lapel microphones. I don't recommend them, and a lot of oral historians don't use them because they don't capture the sound as well. So you want to get an what's called an omnidirectional handheld microphone. The one here, the Electro Voice, is good all around. It captures audio extremely well. And that funny looking rabbit thing there that you see that's gray in the bottom right-hand corner, that's a wind buster, also called a windscreen. That reduces noise. So if you're outside or if you don't have an ideal location, you'll be able to improve the audio quality of the files that you capture. So that's a very, very, very quick overview of recording equipment, because it just gets even way more technical than that the more you get into oral history. And I just want to mention too quickly a note about remote oral history recording. During the pandemic, a lot of oral historians still tried to do recordings using everything from like audio recorder apps on your phone, both Adobe as well as iPhones, Skype, Google Hangouts, even Zoom. And I have a colleague who works at NYU Abu Dhabi, Lauren Kata, and she recommends freeconferencecall.com. Free conference call has been around for a long time. I feel badly that I hadn't really heard about this until recently, but freeconferencecall.com is very high quality and it's free, or pay what you can. And it's really wonderful for students, volunteers. It's a very low end type technology, but it definitely can serve your purpose. There's also a lot of information on the Oral History Association. We say OHA, Oral History Association's remote interviewing resources online. And I just want to add a very particular caution that if you are recording online in some of these platforms that also capture video, be very careful about looking at the specifications for that software, because video files are huge, bigger than audio. And so many tools will compress the files. And if you remember what I said in a few slides ago, that an uncompressed file is ideal. So a compressed file that will sacrifice audio quality for file size is not going to be good for long-term preservation. So please keep that in mind. And please consult these resources that I have links for here. Step 5, actually conducting the interview. Again, more information that you'd put in your toolkit. You want to ensure that you set up a date and time with your narrator in advance. Make sure that it's very clear what you're doing or your purpose is, going back to your program planning. Choose a quiet location that will be comfortable for not only you, but also the narrator that you're interviewing. It's ideal to have them in their comfort zone, right? So, in some ways, online interviewing is good because then you don't have to really go anywhere. But it's bad because it's hard to develop a rapport with people online, much like I'm trying to develop a rapport with you. So having that face-to-face connection is lost in the online context. But regardless, make sure that you don't have any background noise. Avoid distractions as well, like dogs barking, cars in the distance, because that will just lead to more work for you down the road if you have to do some audio cleanup. Make sure your recording equipment is working. Check, check, check. Always carry batteries with you. Make sure you have, AC adapters and other things. Make sure things are operational, and that whoever is doing the interviewing knows how to operate that equipment, because, you certainly don't want to get to the end of an interview and realize that your equipment died or something happened to the file and it got corrupted. And I can't emphasize this enough. I'm going to say it again and again and again. Make sure you get a signed, informed consent or release before you even work with the narrator. If you don't, then that work is considered somewhat orphaned, and you're going to have to go back and try to get a release for someone or from their heirs to ensure that you can actually do something with the interview. So copyright, this was another question that came in advance of the webinar today. Oral history interviews produced in the United States are subject to US copyright law, and it protects them in terms of reproduction, distribution, public performance, and the creation of derivative works. So, snippets of oral histories that you might want to put on your website or use in some other context. So before you do anything, make sure you have a transfer of copyright ownership to the individual interviewer or organization that's sponsoring your project. So your library or your archives or historical society. And the interviewer must also transfer copyright to the sponsor. So ideally, you want to get that signature before you even hit record. And if you want more information about all these legal issues, there's a great book by John Neuschwander called A Guide to Oral History and the Law. And I highly recommend, of course, Baylor University's Institute for Oral History documents on that as well. I think I'm doing okay on time. So let's see, next. Hopefully you're able to absorb all the things that I'm throwing at you today. But really just to sort of reiterate and wrap up what is really crucial for conducting the interview is active listening, preparing ahead of time, maintaining that confidentiality, displaying empathy, particularly during the interview and really at every stage of the way, from the time you first meet someone to schedule an interview to, thanking them at the very end and following up with another thank you. Adhering to ethics of oral history is also really critical. Being flexible, because an interview is, it's a partnership with the narrator. And sometimes interviews take a turn that you didn't expect. So be flexible with that. Also humility. I cannot emphasize that enough. Definitely show humility with your narrator, particularly if they're dealing with a very traumatic or emotionally charged topic in recounting some of their history. Get that informed consent. Make sure that you're developing mutual respect and trust. Take care of privacy and also just show sensitivity. Just all skills that we normally do as librarians anyway. Post-interview work. So if you've gotten through all that, there's still more work to be done. So again, back to the staffing capacity and thinking about, the expertise that you have in-house. This can often be the more challenging aspect, I think, of doing oral histories because, you've got all the contextual materials, the biography, doing a little bit of research, setting up the interview, making sure you got all the equipment, stuff like that. But then after the interview, you have all these derivative materials that you can create. So interview transcripts, those can be done manually, which is extremely time consuming, and many places still don't have transcripts. But I see them as critical to accessibility, especially, considering DEIA and ensuring for patrons who have any type of hindrances to accessing materials online. So it's really important, not only for that reason, but also for preservation. What if your digital file gets corrupted? Like that never happens, right? Oh, I deal with files all the time that get corrupted. In fact, we have a Holocaust oral history collection at Harrisburg, and they were reformatted from VHS to DVD since the 1980s. And over the pandemic, we tried to put the DVDs into a computer that would still read a DVD, and they wouldn't work. So I thought, oh no, what are we going to do? We're going to have to reformat these. Well, fortunately for us, someone else had the same oral histories on DVD, and they were given to the US Holocaust Museum. So if you're a wonderful partnership with the Holocaust Museum, a wonderful woman there in the cataloging department sent me access to the digital files that they had. And now we are doing transcription for the files that essentially were corrupted. So never ever consider your digital files safe. You always have to make sure you check on those. And so if you have a transcript and something happens to the digital file, at least you have the transcription, right? But the audio recording is still considered the primary source. And you can do a lot more with that besides just transcription. You can work on descriptive summaries, so cataloging, all the stuff that we're experts at, right? This is where, our profession is very allied with oral history. They might not be as familiar with, MARC cataloging or different types of glossaries and standard terminology, but that's where we excel, right? So we can partner a lot with oral historians. And then time coding to recordings and indexing them, again, this is our bread and butter as librarians and archivists. In terms of software, what do you get to edit the files? Well, I highly recommend Audacity. Number one, it's cheap. You can get it for free. Of course, it's going to have some limited capabilities. And please be careful with Audacity that sometimes just what's called destructive editing can be a problem where you like lose the file. So always save as that WAV file for preservation. There's also another tool that a lot of oral historians use called Hindenburg. It's not free, but it's really great for noise reduction. Step 6 is more of that post-interview work, and this can be a whole subspecialty for oral history, and that's not manual, but automated transcription. And oral historians are really working hard on developing expertise with this. I had a pilot project a number of years ago to look at manual transcription and the time it takes versus automated transcription services, which were still kind of fledgling back in like 2017, 2018. Amazon Transcribe through their Amazon Web Services has a free 60 minutes a month for 12 months program, but you really need an IT expert to help you out with that. I had a really hard time and I thought I knew some stuff about IT and I was frustrated. It has a high learning curve, difficult to install, doesn't have a lot of like bells and whistles. By contrast, Trint.com does. Trint.com is very popular. We use it at Penn State. We have a large scale license to that. And it's a weird name, Trint, but it means transcription plus interview. And it was actually developed for the journalism field, who I didn't realize this when they're out in the field, they need like a transcript right away to get stuff to press. So this software has been out since 2016, started by journalists in London. So that can be a downside to it, is that you have to send your files over to the UK. But it's all done over the internet and it happens pretty quickly. Just keep that in mind. It's not based in the US. It is audio to text algorithms. There's a free 7-day trial, so you can take a look at it. You can also get a monthly or price plan. It's gone up a little bit. It used to be a little bit cheaper than it is now, but the most affordable rate's about $50 a month. It has some really cool enhanced features, such as a vocabulary builder. It can translate even with like the Southern accent in the US versus the New England accent, British accent. And it translates up to 54 languages. It's very easy to use, has some great abilities such as capturing from Zoom if you're going to do an online platform. And also there's a Trint iPhone app. So I highly recommend Trint, but there's other tools out there too. And step 7, sharing your oral histories online. Back to that legal form. You can't really do anything with your oral histories, and why would you want to anyway, without legal permissions, and make sure that the narrator has agreed to you putting these online. Maybe they have a restriction that, they don't want their family to hear the stories about, their grandmother or aunt or something terrible happened in the family, and they don't want that available online. So you have to, of course, be transparent and respect that. You can use audio files, MP3s, to put them online. Again, that's a derivative file. You don't want to save that as your archival file. You want your WAV file and then spin off an MP3 to make it smaller in file size to put it online. And with video files, same thing. MPEG-2 is preferred for preservation, but MPEG-4 is great to put on YouTube. And another bonus with Trint.com is that it has a Trint player, that it embeds the video and a transcript to the website. So once you're done transcribing in Trint, you literally can create this link to put a YouTube video up on your website, which is really awesome. And it's very, very seamless. Marketing, I'm preaching to the choir with this. You guys all know as librarians how to market things to users and stakeholders. Definitely push things out to social media. I think there was a question before the webinar about, how do you promote and get people interested in oral history? Be excited, be positive about it. Oral history is hot right now. It's a primary source. Someone else asked, is oral history important to academic librarianship? Yes, of course it is. Oral histories are primary sources. As academic librarians and archivists, we are trying to encourage the use of primary sources. So why not be an active participant in creating those sources by working on an oral history project? You can target your prospective users and then, of course, future narrators, because if people get jazzed about your project, then maybe they would like to contribute. And then that word of mouth marketing, that snowball effect of you get one person who you interview and then they know 5 people and then they know 5 people. It's just endless. And soon you'll be completely out of staffing capacity and you'll need more people to help you. Of course, it's a really cool thing to promote during library open house events or, you know, a day where you're featuring new projects for your library. And I always think that it's a great idea to include oral histories in exhibits or displays. You could use a QR code and link to like a website or, you know, some files that you might have up on your own in-house cloud service. Here's an example of one thing I did a couple of years ago, pre-pandemic, of course, and we had our open house / Parents' Day / alumni event, and it was a perfect opportunity for me to keep the archives open and to grab the attention of the alumni who were always coming back to our campus. So I made up these flyers, and that was also in conjunction with a book that I wrote about Penn State Harrisburg. So there's tons of history that is going to be lost if we don't do more. And so again, yes, oral history is really important to academic librarianship. So get out there, join the Oral History Association, and you know, become an active participant in preserving history. So speaking of that, the final step is assessment as well as long-term preservation strategies. I used to be a digital collections librarian, so it's funny how things really intersect, you know, as you progress in your career. But we're all used to looking at usage metrics. Depending upon where you work, you might not have the same tools as, you know, larger organizations, but try to figure out who's using your oral histories and why. Maybe you should embed a feedback form, whether that's online or in paper. When people come into your library, ask them, you know, if they're interested in participating in your project. And then the statistics that you do gather should help you further prioritize projects and maybe seek funding from donors, especially when it comes to something like transcription, because that, you know, that can be an expensive part of this whole process. So long-term preservation strategies, I will again emphasize, always, always, always save your preservation copies of audio, video, and transcriptions in a lossless, meaning not losing data, uncompressed file format. Use WAV, not MP3 for audio, and use the MPEG-2, MPEG-4 for video. And just like we do for digital preservation for collections and other content that we're creating as librarians, always use the 3-2-1 strategy for digital files. And that is create 3 copies. The lots of copies keep stuff safe. You've probably heard of that acronym. So make 1 primary sort of master copy that's archival that you don't necessarily touch, and then 2 derivative backups. Keep the data, at least 2 types of storage media. So maybe like a local drive versus a portable network drive that you keep in like a vault, which is what I do. And then also offsite storage, because, you know, something happens to your library, God forbid, but you have like maybe a cloud service, and redundancy is always wonderful. Over the pandemic, my desktop computer completely just crashed. Fortunately, I'd had a backup, and then also my laptop at work got wiped clean. So thank goodness for backup strategies. So final thoughts about oral history. Dr. Paul Ortiz at the University of Florida, the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program, has also been very instrumental in my learning about oral history. And I just want to emphasize, he says the success of the interview depends on the amount of trust and understanding the interviewer is able to create with the narrator or the interviewer or interviewee. So courtesy, empathy, humility, these are all really important things, ethics, and they're a big part of that process. So finally, I have tons of oral history resources here, how to learn more from Baylor University. Also, the Oral History in the Digital Age Best Practices Wiki is great. The Oral History Society out of the UK has advice for beginners. The Smithsonian Folklife and Oral History Center has an interviewing guide. There's many different professional organizations you can be active in. I've been very active in the Oral History Association here in the United States. There's also several regional ones. There's one in the Southwest Oral History and then Mid-Atlantic region. Tons of books. A lot of folks I know who are excellent oral historians know way more than I do. Always cite Valerie Yao's book, Recording Oral History, A Guide for the Humanities and Social Sciences. I also really like Donald Ritchie's work, Doing Oral History from Oxford University Press. And of course, there's also journals to keep up with, you know, new scholarship and new topics of discussion. The Oral History Review, which I have a copy of here, which I guess is not showing up because of my background, but you can see in the bottom corner there a picture of that. There's tons of blogs and online sources for even more information. And then there's some excellent oral history centers who are doing amazing work. Baylor's been around for 50 years down in Texas. Columbia University, I believe, is one of the first oral history centers. The Nunn Center, and I mentioned Doug Boyd many times, he's at the University of Kentucky. And then of course, University of Florida. And no one asked me this, but I figured people would ask me, what are your favorite oral history collections online? Well, that's like asking who's your favorite child or what's your favorite artist. So it's really hard to just pick one thing. So I thought I'd put together a few here that I highly regard. There's a meta site from the Oral History in the Digital Age website. StoryCorps does an amazing job. And there's just so much work being done at the Library of Congress with the Veterans History Project. So I highly recommend checking some of those links out. And lastly, I just want to thank my colleagues and fellow members of the Oral History Association's Archives Interest Group, OHA-AIG, who've been so pivotal. My colleague Tim Babcock at Penn State in particular, Doug Boyd, David Olson at Columbia, James Fowler, who's at the US State Department, Lauren Kata, who's in Abu Dhabi, NYU, Stephen Seeloff at Baylor, Jennifer Snyder at the Archives of American Art, and my former co-chair, Tina Wright at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Been so instrumental in teaching me, and OHA is a very welcoming group. So I highly recommend folks who might be a little bit hesitant to certainly check us out, because the OHA is an absolutely wonderful professional organization. And lastly, Dr. Henry Glassy, an internationally known folklorist. And he was the first person I had to interview, the first person that I ever had to conduct an interview with. So no pressure, only an internationally known folklorist who knows a lot about oral history. And also someone more local, Charlie Hardy, who's former president of the OHA and is here at Westchester University. I attended an amazing workshop with him on cooking with sound. So really influential in my knowledge of oral history. So now I think it's time for questions and comments. It's 11:42, and here's my contact information if you don't have questions now. I tried to address many of them throughout the discussion today, but you can certainly contact me at Penn State Harrisburg through my email or any of the links that are in the PowerPoint. So thank you very much. I think I'll stop my share and turn it back over to the Connect and Communicate folks. Amy.
Hey, thanks. Yes, feel free to put your questions in the chat box. I see there's a question, would this PowerPoint be available to download? Heidi, I'll leave that up to you if we're going to share this or not. Okay. Yeah, so we will put that with the recording.
Thanks, Karen, for your comment. I appreciate the feedback. And Brian, I'd be happy to share my PowerPoint. Hopefully all the links are working fine, because I think that, this is one of those topics that, okay, hopefully I've whet your appetite to cook with sound and to become an oral historian, or at least try to think about that for your library. And it is sustainable, but there's so much more to learn. So, hopefully my PowerPoint will just be a springboard for that. What was the one part of the three? Are you referring, Jill, to the 3-2-1 digital preservation strategy? I think you are. The first one is making 3 copies. Is Jill out
Yes,
there?
I was. I'm sorry. I hit enter before I finished typing. Sorry.
Oh, that's okay. That's okay. So did that make sense? So one is, make 3 copies. I mean, that's true of like creating images. You always, like, if you have an image, you scan something, you want to save it as a TIFF, because you're going to get all the digital information that you can. Then you make derivative files, which are JPEGs. In the case of audio, it's the same thing. Save as a WAV file or raw file format that's not compressed, uncompressed file format, and then make derivative copies. And then those 2 copies, you have your master would be 1, and then 2 and 3 are copies. 2 store it on site and 3 off site. Hope that helps. Brian. Is it okay, Amy, if I just look at the questions?
Go for it. Yeah.
Okay. So Brian, what are some of the best ways to find people to interview? Social media, other marketing? That's a great question. Know your community. Talk to people. If you're interested in gathering information about, maybe some World War II vets that are in your community, and you're trying to do, what the Library of Congress has done, go to where those people are. Try to figure out the places that they commune or that they visit, and talk to people. Invite them to your library. You might not want to bombard them with like your oral history program, but just like you would do with any other kind of networking, start small. And again, consider your scope and your scale. You want to make sure that before you even start doing any of this stuff that you've thought about how you're going to do it and who you're going to do it, because you need to explain that to the people that you interview. They need to understand that if they're going to share their story with you, that it's going to be preserved and that it's going to be accessible over time. So be transparent about that. So yeah, social media, word of mouth marketing is fabulous. When I was working with the Mount Gretna board of directors, I used to attend as many events as I could to get to know the people in the community. So they trusted me. Nobody was going to be interested in talking to me if they thought, oh, who are you? And why do you want to know my story? Right? I mean, someone's opening up themselves to you. So just think of it from that standpoint. Does that help, Brian? Okay. So hopefully it does. So moving on, Abby, can you speak a little more about approaching subjects or cultures that, as the interviewer, you may not be a part of or not experience? That's an excellent question. I attended an Oral History Association meeting in Montreal, Canada. Fabulous. Highly recommend OHA meetings and traveling to Canada whenever we can in the future. And something I learned there was, there's a lot of Indigenous peoples in the Canadian culture, and working with Indigenous groups or other groups that have historically been very marginalized, you definitely need to do your research. It's important to know your narrator, know the culture from which they're coming, and to be respectful. And back to the trust issue, you certainly want to develop empathy and you want to show humility. So start to think about the words that you're using, and be careful about using open-ended questions and closed questions. This is a process, right? It's a partnership between the narrator and the interviewer. So that's a skill that you're going to learn over time. And there's plenty of resources online that are going to go into a lot more detail than I have time to today. So please go back to the Baylor Institute or some of the links that I've mentioned to answer some more of that question. Does that help, Abby? I think, okay, great. Great questions, everybody. Putting me on my oral history toes. Anybody else have any other questions or something that I didn't cover that you think, oh, I wish I knew more about this aspect of oral history? It really is great. I feel so lucky to be part of the oral history community. Like I said, it's a very allied profession, and as an academic librarian and archivist, I see it as a really pivotal opportunity to be part of creating history and preserving history. Amy or Adam, anybody have any other questions that may have come in privately? Like I know that some people might not want to post to the chat, and you might feel more comfortable sharing with folks with CRD.
Yeah, I haven't seen anything, but I just have a curiosity question. It sounded like you had a Penn State oral history project potentially you were doing. What kind of projects are you working on now?
Oh, sure. Oh, I'm glad you mentioned that. Because I did just touch upon the Holocaust oral history project that we've been doing over the pandemic. And as I mentioned, it had to do with preservation, right? I mean, behind me here in this virtual picture, we have the oral histories of Holocaust survivors and liberators from the Harrisburg area. And they were given to us by the Jewish Community Center by way of Dr. Simon Broder, a very well-known folklorist, emeritus faculty at my campus. In any event, the oral histories were captured in some ways, not necessarily utilizing all the best practices that we have been talking about today. And that happens, right? I mean, it's okay. We do what we can with the resources that we have and the legacy histories that we have. And as a result of the reformatting over time, they eventually were on DVDs, and we went to access one and they wouldn't play. So over the pandemic, we reached out to the Holocaust Museum, and they graciously shared with us their video, audio files. And now we're doing transcription of those. That's a big project that we've been working on for the past 2 years. There's 69 of them. And then the oral history, there's also a big oral history project that we started a number of years ago because we had 40 plus people retire from my college. And that's a lot. That's a huge amount of institutional memory that's just gone overnight. And Penn State Harrisburg is young. It's not the youngest campus in the Penn State system, but next to the second youngest. And, you know, we're talking about 50 years of history here that would be lost. So we started to use something called the one button studio that Penn State has. We literally hit one button, lights come on, the audio records, and, you know, next thing you know, you have these great oral history files. And so we started interviewing administrators, faculty members, people who had a lot of the documentary memory of Penn State Harrisburg. Because of the pandemic, of course, we've had to table some of that. And I want to make a note that, you know, some people don't want to be interviewed. We ran into that. We actually ran into interviewing someone, and this person said, oh gosh, I didn't get my hair done, and I really didn't know I was going to be videotaped. And, you know, again, be transparent, warn your narrators that you're going to do either audio only, audio and video, because not everybody wants to be recorded, you know, visually. I know I don't like being recorded visually, and here I am on this webinar. So does that answer your question, Amy? I think I probably went off on a tangent. Oh, I have a private chat. Would you recommend audio recording over video? And should you stick with one method? That's a great question. Well, far be it from me to understand what's happening in your library. Audio certainly is easier, I think. In some ways, I'm going to put a little asterisk next to that because audio has its challenges too. But video files are just bigger. And dealing with video file formats is more complicated. So if you want to start small, I would say just work with audio. And then, you know, if you're comfortable with video yourself as the interviewee, you know, think about your narrator too. Maybe they don't want to be videotaped. So there's all those caveats too. So I would say start with audio, and essentially it's kind of scope creep, right? You can do audio and video, but then it just gets more complicated the more you do. And no, I wouldn't say you should stick with one method. I would say that to respect your staffing capacity, your budgets, your expertise, the file sizes you have, you know, maybe audio is a lot simpler, but I think the answer to that really depends upon your local organization and your skill set. Thank you for that question. We still have 7 minutes to go. Any other questions coming in, Amy or Adam, privately?
Not that I see, though. I'm going to still encourage people to continue to ask things. I'm going to do a short little wrap up in case someone has to get to another meeting at noon. So I'd like to thank all of you for joining us today, and I'd like to thank Heidi Abby Moyer for presenting for us. I hope everyone will take a few moments to complete our survey, which I'm going to put in the chat box, to let us know your thoughts about the presentation today and about our programming in general. As a reminder, the recording of this presentation will be available to PALA members through the PALA website. And if you're not a PALA member and you're interested in becoming a member, again, feel free to reach out to me or one of the team. I'm going to put my email in the chat box, and we'll have the appropriate person contact you. I'd also invite you to contact one of us if your suggestions for future discussions or presentations, and most definitely I would invite you to contact us if you'd like to present. So it looks like we have another question.
Yeah, and before I forget, I just want to say thank you again so much to Amy and Adam and everyone involved with PALA, and in particular the webinar series with CRD. This is the second time I've presented with this series, and it's always been great. I've always enjoyed it. So the last question I see is, how did you set up your one button Penn State device? Well, you can go to one button, just Google one button Studio Penn State. I don't believe that it's open source. I could be wrong about that, but it was something that we developed at Penn State, and it's not like you can just like buy it. So I didn't set it up. The IT people did, and it was really great. And it was intended to help students to create video content, audio content. So you just literally hit a button. You don't need to know about all these file formats and standards and things that I've been telling you about. But you can certainly Google One Button Studio at Penn State to learn more about that. Thanks for that question. Well, I hope I've encouraged everybody to think about oral history, to think about, you know, our allied professions as librarians and how we can better intersect with them, because at the end of the day, we're all doing very similar things and just maybe using different words to describe it. So I'm a big fan of kind of reaching out to our allied professionals and learning from each other. Oh, you're welcome. Good to see a thank you in the chat. So definitely check out the Oral History Association, the Archives Interest Group. We have these great monthly, bi-monthly meetings, and you know, you can talk to Stephen Seeloff from Baylor University down in Texas, and he's just like a wealth of information. Same thing with Doug Boyd, Tina Wright, David Olson. People all over the world come to the Oral History Association Archives Interest Group. We had people from London. So you can learn so much from other people, and it's a really welcoming group. So please definitely visit those sites. Oh, thanks, Jill. I hope I didn't forget to thank somebody. Always thank your narrator at the very end too. Oh, thanks, Helen. Yeah. Woohoo, class of 93. Yay. I need to interview you. Email me. The college campus has changed a lot since 1993.
I think we can probably stop the recording now, and that way if anyone has any questions they didn't want on the recording or